Well, gee, Grant, that was pretty nice. Thank you.
You ready?
Oh, that's right, I did. Good afternoon, everybody. And since I'm smiling here, we'll hope that I know how people feel or how I feel right after lunch. Hopefully we can keep you awake for the next few minutes. If you do nod off, talk to the person ahead of time next to you so that they can nudge you so you don't hurt yourself when your head hits the table, please. Okay, so we heard this morning about water and what a powerful force that is in the environment. I think if you look in most native customs, it recognizes certain forces as being major forces. The second one, and we've referred to it really starting this morning and throughout this conference, fire is the other major factor. So what has amazed me over time from a fire standpoint is how much water interacts in your fire and fire behavior system. So those are some of the things that we have to get a better understanding of as we go forward. So what we want to kind of think about for this is prescribed fire. What I have here on that lead slide is prescribed fire for tomorrow, learning from the past. And we certainly had the opportunity to learn about fire in a water environment, mainly the conservation areas that have been referenced several times here. So that's where I began my career. If you have ever heard rumors that Jim started his career by smoking out Miami International Airport and shutting down flight operations, let me dispel that theory or rumor very quickly. That never happened. Miami International might have gone what's known as IFR for a little while, which would be instrument flight rules. So that's sort of my beginning. Joe Frank was earlier referenced. South Florida actually was probably one of the first prescribed fire councils that were formed. And if you didn't know what might have triggered that, Joe again mentioned severe fires. And so I'm holding up a report. It's Wildland Fire Management in South Florida. This is a 1974 publication. South Florida burned in 1972, 73, and 74 in a fashion and so pervasive that we haven't come anywhere close to matching that in the ensuing 45 years. So, and I hope that we never see fires of that nature again. But this is a good report for a lot of the things that Florida has done with fire and prescribed fire in particular. They are in, this is the forerunner of a lot of those things. So I have a quote here, and it's actually from John Bethea, who was the forester that called that conference about 15 miles from here in October of 74. You can no more get to where you don't know where you're going than you got to where you think you are from where you don't know where you've been. I use that in classes for a long time, and I have to tell you, I gave a bunch of different versions of that. So now in red on that slide, and I think everybody can see that, I have Jim's translation of that convoluted quote. So the first thing is, if we're going to accomplish anything significant, we should know the past. We spent a lot of time talking about that already, certainly with hydrology and the history of the tribes. You need to know the past. It's also very important to understand the present. Where are we? The climate change issue. Where are we today? Understand the present so that you can do what? So that you can take action for the future. And that's really what the focus of these first two talks are this afternoon. We want to talk about, in terms of prescribed fire programs, how can you improve and develop prescribed fire programs that will meet the needs of the future. I think we've talked about this quite a bit already. I know Joe Frank referenced it. We know that fire has always been a part of North America's landscape. It was nice in conversations earlier. We talked about that within Florida, there's two trains of thought, and there are a lot of folks who are lightning only proponents, that lightning fires alone shaped the fire environment. I'm pleased that we have on this panel some folks who might offer a contrary opinion, one that I've long held. If Florida as we know it today has evolved with people, there was not a Florida that people can look back to and say, I want Florida to look like it did before people got here. I don't know exactly what that means, because for 12,000 years people have been here, and if you look at Florida in the last ice age, it was not anywhere near what it is today. In fact, it was about twice the size 12,000 years ago that it is today. In other words, Florida occupied about 70 million acres of land, but with rising sea levels, Florida has shrunk in size to 35 million acres, all with people present on the ground. I'm pretty sure folks learned how to use fire fairly early on during that 12,000 year episode. Again, Joe Frank referenced this. Our traditional version for a lot of the classes we've taught in the past, we referred to cattlemen in the 1800s as those primarily responsible for maintaining fire on the ground. Well, if we didn't know it before, and from listening to Joe Frank, who were the first cattlemen in Florida? Native Americans, Seminole Indians. And did they run cattle, and can we be pretty sure that they continued to use fire? And then the Euro-Americans, this is actually Bone Mizell from up around Okeechobee County, I guess, and that is a Frederick Remington drawing for those of you from the West and familiar with Frederick Remington, fairly renowned artist in the West. But anyway, cattlemen continued the use of fire, and it was a practice that was continued well into the 1900s. So what happened in Florida coincides with about the time I came to work. For Florida, we had big changes in the 70s and 80s. We had Disney come to Florida in about 1970. And that's, of course, made major changes and even further increased the rate of growth and development in the state. The wildfires ravaged South Florida in 71, 72, and 74. In Florida also, we heard some references to this before, but through that process, we truly became a fragmented landscape as we shifted from draining the swamp to water management and more intensive land management. So those are three big things that have changed the face of Florida, which means that the things we do in the future have to be to address the conditions that are in place now and the conditions that we'll encounter in the future. So what we hope to do with these next two talks, we want to talk and think about how will you use fire tomorrow. Everyone, you should have a vision of that. And we're all engaged. It's just like wildlife belongs to all of us. We all have a stewardship responsibility. And I know I'm, so to speak, we heard a reference to Catholics and choirs, I guess. So I know in one sense I'm preaching to the choir, because you as Native Americans, or those of you who are Native Americans and First Nations people, you know that better than all of the rest of us combined, but have a vision of fire-maintained habitats. Have some clear objectives for what you want to do. Get help. We can no longer, the idea that we can do things by ourselves or with a very small team is an obsolete practice with 6 billion people on Earth. Prepare some plans and advice in advance. and burn according to those plans. And if I've learned one lesson with workforce diversity, I know now, whereas at one time I thought, oh, you needed to be absolutely objective in everything that you do. Well, guess what? It is good to be passionate about the things that you do and the things that you care about. But when it comes to science-based things, we need to try to be as objective as we can. We also need to, and this is a practice that has happened in the wildfire community, we need to learn from everyone's mistakes, and that's a system that we have in place, and I'd like to say we have it in place perfectly, but the truth is, if you look at major mistakes in wildfire management, we're still committing some of the same mistakes. So we need to learn and actually implement things that will allow us to make those kinds of mistakes of the past. But more importantly, we need to learn from success. And it's really the things that are successful that we want to do and repeat in the future. So let's think about all of the knowledge about fire. If it occupied this whole room from the floor to the ceiling, from the front to the back, how much do you know about fire? I probably know about what's carried in the volume of this pen cap is probably what I know about fire. And if you collectively put it all together, we still only know a little bit about it. What's even more important, we can't afford to lose. We have to figure out ways to pass that on. So I'm going to go ahead and have our first speaker, who is Jeff Eustache, and he's the manager for Forest Fuel Management Department with the First Nations Emergency Services Society, and that's actually a nonprofit organization, as I understand it. Jeff will correct me if I miss a little bit, but that's a nonprofit organization that assists First Nations tribes, if you will, within British Columbia to try to develop better management programs. And so that's what he'll be talking about, is some of the approaches and strategies that they'll be employing. Jeff, we're so happy you could be here.